Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast. My name is Cam Scott, and I'm here with Rob Crooks, discussing contemporary events in Cuba and the ongoing struggle of the Cuban people to defend their revolution from U.S. imperialism. So here we are recording this episode mere days into the second Trump administration in the United States. Trump was inaugurated on Blue Monday, which is said to be the most depressing day of the year. And I think that he only added to the burden. Yeah. It was a total shocker, though I think we were all prepared for the worst, just in terms of the array of attacks by way of executive orders. Within one day of taking office, Trump made good on all kinds of campaign pledges to various reactionary causes and ruling class interests. One of these executive orders was to immediately reverse a small sign of hope from the last days of the Biden administration, catapulting us back to the concluding hours of the first Trump administration, where Trump had added Cuba once again to the United States state sponsors of terrorism list. This was an act of really unbridled revenge against Cuba's independence, against the progress that had been made during Obama's last term. So we are right back to those last days of the Trump administration where his bellicosity spelled disaster for Cubans.
Yeah. And, it's a bit of it's sort of like, it's obviously difficult to get into the head of Biden, but even though the writing was sort of on the wall that Trump would reverse this, it's sort of like Biden admitting that Cuba shouldn't be on this list. And that he didn't want it on his hands. He didn't want it on his conscience or whatever. Like, he's admitting that it's wrong. So it was a bit of a strange choice, and I'm not exactly sure what we can think of it other than a very sort of symbolic victory, because it's the ruling power demonstrating that it knows that it's wrong and that Cuba doesn't belong on this list.
Absolutely. And I think that Biden, who campaigned on a pledge to remove Cuba from the list, who was trying to draw upon the, albeit rather slim, progressive legacy of Obama, he repeatedly said that he would remove Cuba from the list during his campaign, and then he took office in 2021 and left it for so long that... Yeah. In this way, this is maybe part of a bid for posterity. It's a legacy-making move. He wants to leave the incoming Trump administration with a series of, I think, maximally embarrassing diplomatic imbroglios. But at the same time, he left this progressive development to the last days of an outgoing, decrepit administration so that it could be immediately rolled back. He left it open to attack from the right. He ensured that no salutary policies of normalization could have taken root during his administration by stalling on this for so long.
Yeah, it was really a snake move. So now that, Cuba's back on this list, so this list is obviously just adds to the effects of the blockade. Because they're on this list, it sort of makes international banks and other financial institutions basically not want to touch Cuba with a 10-foot pole. In the 5 years since Trump originally put them put Cuba on this SSOT list, Cuba lost relationships with 1,000 financial banking institutions.
Yeah, that's staggering.
Tourism from Europe decreased significantly as a direct consequence of the inclusion and maintenance of being on this list. Cubans with Spanish citizenship, had a much more difficult time going back and forth from Cuba and Spain. Cubans residing in the European Union have been denied bank accounts and have had existing accounts frozen because their nationality as Cuban makes them quote unquote high risk clients. Being on this list prevents any sort of partnerships in universities or any kind of academic work or work between artists and writers. And it's also made it very difficult for groups who are trying to fundraise for Cuba for some humanitarian aid. It makes it very difficult for them to get money to Cuba because no bank will facilitate that transaction. And of course, it makes it much more difficult for Cuba to go and buy things on the international market. I mean, how can you buy things on the international market when no bank is going to facilitate that transaction? So it's, Cuba, for all of the U.S.'s liberalism, this stops Cuba from going and buying food or buying, whatever it is, agricultural inputs or whatever the case may be. So this is a really cruel list to include Cuba on.
It's absolutely a cruelty, and the list itself is, a scandal. It's spurious. It's a very flimsy designation that has been used to, I suppose, accuse in aggregate the so-called axis of evil or countries outside the U.S. sphere of influence. You could characterize as belonging to a socialist bloc or a non-aligned movement, any combination of these, but it's always on very, very flimsy evidence that these countries that are thusly listed and sanctioned are said to promote international terrorism. It's a basically fraudulent list, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to give a little bit of background on this list, Cuba was originally put on the state sponsor of terrorism list back in the 80s by Ronald Reagan. It stayed on that list until 2015 when Obama removed Cuba from the list and tried to take a sort of new path to thawing relationships with Cuba. That's when Obama visited Cuba. And then, of course, we know at the end of Trump's first term in office is when he put Cuba back on the list. And so the reason that is given for Cuba's inclusion on this list has to do with the claims that they are Cuba's harboring U.S. fugitives, that they're harboring leaders of Colombian rebel groups, and that they support the government of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. So, I mean, these, of course, are all really bogus reasons. And, of course, specifically with like the Colombian rebel groups, we know that Cuba was instrumental in the peace talks with the ELN, the rebel group in Colombia, and the Colombian government, to the point where the president of Colombia was removing the extradition request that he had for those ELN members. So the Colombian government wasn't even calling for those members of ELN to be sent back to Cuba. So it's completely a bogus list. I mean, this idea that Cuba can't have relationships with Venezuela, or that people like Assata Shakur are living in Cuba, and so this somehow means that Cuba is sponsoring terrorism. It's completely cynical and it's completely absurd, really.
Well, it's preposterous, as well as a slight to its political independence. There's obviously the irony that, particularly after the collapse of the USSR, the US blockade of Cuba has, if anything, necessitated a greater proximity to Venezuela where fuel and so on is concerned. So it's really criminalizing and punishing the inevitable outcome of the total effects of the blockade.
Oh,
And
exactly.
I had no idea. I mean, you hear again and again about the refusal to extradite members of the National Liberation Army. I didn't even know that Colombia was no longer requesting that extradition. You know, it's
Yeah, I think that might have changed recently because of the relationship between the National Liberation Army and the Colombian government sort of deteriorating at the moment. But
yeah,
certainly,
of course,
when Trump added them to that list, I don't think they were calling for extradition. But, you know, I mean, the other irony, of course, is that far from being a sponsor of terrorism, um, Cuba is actually the victim of terrorism, and not just terrorism, but in fact, U.S. backed terrorist acts going all the way back to the 60s. Of course, people have heard of Operation Peter Pan, where the US government was spreading disinformation that the Cuban communist government was somehow going to steal their children and make them common property or whatever the the propaganda was. I'm not even clear on it, but based on that operation, they basically stole 14,000 Cuban minors between the age of 6 and 18. Between 1960 and 1963, Operation Mongoose was a campaign of terrorist acts against the Cuban people to, try to cause chaos in the country. From 1960 to 1961, there were a number of department stores in Havana that were the targets of terrorist bombings. In 1961, a young student who was sent to rural areas to teach literacy was captured and tortured and killed. Some other examples that the Cuban government blames the U.S. for is like a series of terrorist attacks and germ warfare that were targeting crops and livestock, which was happening in 1962, where they were trying to infect the sugar crops. In 1971, there was an outbreak of African swine fever that the Cuban government
yeah,
is pretty sure came from the United States. That ended up killing 500,000 pigs. Of course, in 1976, the Cubana Airlines bombing, which was planned by people who were tied to the CIA, and this, of course, isn't just an opinion. This is a documented fact. In 1981, there was an outbreak of dengue fever that sickened more than 300,000 people that the Cuban government has also accused the United States of facilitating. I mean, the list goes on. In 1997, the same people who organized the Cubana Airlines explosion were also doing a wave of bombings at hotels and discotheques to deter tourism. And this was in a time after the fall of the Soviet Union, where Cuba had to find new ways of, I guess, what's the word, like stimulating their economy through tourism, right? So they were really turning to tourism at this time. And so to attack this, these terrorists were blowing up hotels. In 2020, of course, there was the guy who shot rifles at the Cuban embassy building in DC. They know who it was. I'm not sure if he was arrested, but he's not in jail right now. We know that. And just recently, just last year, the Cuban authorities captured a 40-year-old man who was coming from Florida to Cuba with carrying firearms and ammunition. and had intended to recruit people and start an armed uprising supported and financed by the United States government. And, this is not a complete list, and nor does it even include the 600 plus attempts on Fidel Castro's life.
Absolutely.
So,
Which, he parlayed into a sort of romantic aura, the moral vest, but it's practically unprecedented. You can't imagine any world leader facing that many assassination attempts over so many decades that were more or less explicitly supported by the United States government, as I understand.
yeah, I mean, it's abhorrent, right? You have this government, biggest superpower in the world, attacking a country that's 11 million people, that poses absolutely no threat to the United States, and yet, the United States is just economically crushing this country, or attempting to. They have failed so far because of the faith that the Cuban people have in the revolution. But they're just trying to put all their power to lean on this country. I mean, they're calling them a terrorist, a sponsor of terrorism. Meanwhile, we all know that the United States is arming a genocide in Palestine right now. It's just the hypocrisy is unbelievable.
Absolutely, and this is the backdrop against which Cuba would have been added to the list to begin with. You mentioned the Reagan era in 1982, correct? Cuba's added to the state sponsors of terrorism list, right? So if you look at the evidence at that point, they are talking about the proximity of the Cuban government to the PLO, or to Arafat during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, things like this. It's also possible to look at the material connections to allegedly terroristic interests, and in almost every case, you find, I believe, a humanistic socialist motive from a Cuban standpoint for their relationship with what is essentially a national liberation movement.
Mm-hmm.
Their sins include training Palestinian doctors,
Mm-hmm.
as a facet of their medical internationalism and so on. Things for which the United States could never forgive them. Harboring Eldridge Cleaver on his way to Algeria to establish the Black Panthers International section, their resiliency corresponds to all of these anti-systemic and counter-hegemonic movements. So really, on one hand, I've said that it's essentially a slander, but I would even propose to constructively re-narrate it, because if you look at the laundry list of reasons why Cuba appears on this list, they are kind of accolades for Cuba's revolutionary government and their international solidarity from another standpoint.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's their international solidarity is part of the reason that really irks the ruling class in the United States. And it really is, I mean, the United States, like, it really is a unilateral blockade. I mean, of course, we know that the capital is no friend of socialism and socialist governments, but it's, other countries, whether it's our own country, Canada, or countries in the European Union, there has been strong condemnation of this blockade. And of course, the UN General Assembly vote every year, which overwhelmingly votes to end the blockade, is just more proof that the United States more and more stands alone on this issue. And they just remain stubbornly stuck in the mud with this. It's really unfortunate. But now we have a new Trump administration. We have a new Trump government for at least the next 4 years. And what's worse is we have Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State.
A scoundrel.
So, a scoundrel. And, he's of Cuban descent, but he grew up, I think he moved to different cities in the United States when he was growing up. But of course, his formative years were in Florida, which is the bastion of counter-revolutionary Cubans. But we know that Rubio is, basically he's on the wrong side of every issue. And, his sort of claim, the reasoning he gives for his complete disdain for the revolutionary government in Cuba is that he claimed that his family had to escape Cuba after the revolution in 1959, but a Washington Post story in 2011 debunked this and actually showed that Rubio's parents came to the United States in 56, 57, so before the revolution even happened. And even his parents actually even went back to Cuba after the revolution and visited, for weeks at a time before coming back to their home in Florida. So just sort of showing that like this made up narrative of this great repression that Rubio's family so-called suffered is just a complete fabrication.
Absolutely. And he has obviously made hay of this reputation that, his family are fugitives from this doomed socialist system and so on. He spoke very recently about the rolling blackouts and all of these respects in which you can see the toll of the U.S. blockade. We're talking 6+ decades of a blockade that's been condemned by the entire world over many, many times. It's flagrantly illegal. It's all transpiring in plain sight. And he will claim that this is owing to the failures of Marxism, to corruption and ineptitude. It's scarcely believable, but he has a great deal of power over Cuba policy and is regarded as the author pretty much of Trump's orientation toward Latin America as a whole, as I understand it.
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine 2.0. Yeah, I mean it's not just Cuba that is being threatened by the new Trump administration. Of course, he's threatening to make Canada the 51st state. He's threatening to take over Greenland. He's threatening to take over the Panama Canal. I think the U.S. just got the okay to build military bases on Galapagos Island. So it's going to be quite the next 4 years. And I think that now more than ever, this shows that we need to stand in solidarity with Cuba and the Cuban people. And I would urge anybody listening to this that if they are not already members of solidarity groups, that they look into what Cuba solidarity groups are functioning or are active in their communities and see if they can't go, if not join the organizations, then go support their events because that's very important.
It's a decisive time for Cuba and its revolution, but also for the entire counter-hegemonic project of which it is a part and the socialist horizon it represents. We're entering into a new Cold War and a period of unprecedented, grandstanding, bellicose, warmongering rhetoric from the United States. So I think that this is an absolutely essential time to mobilize.
Agreed. Thanks, Cam.
Thanks, Rob.
El día primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.